Picture this: a man standing alone in the rain, watching his own funeral from across the street. His wife is crying at the podium. His children stand beside the casket with their heads bowed. But something feels wrong. The tears don't reach their eyes. The grief seems rehearsed, and as the casket is lowered into the ground, he hears something that makes his blood run cold. His wife turns to his son and whispers just loud enough for the microphone to catch it. Finally, we can move forward. That man was 68-year-old Richard Calloway, a self-made billionaire who spent decades building an empire, only to discover that the people he loved most in the world had been waiting for him to die. This is his story, and I promise you, it will change the way you see family, love, and money forever. Richard Calloway was not born into wealth. He grew up in a small town in Ohio, the son of a factory worker and a schoolteacher. His childhood was modest, but it was filled with love and discipline. His father worked double shifts to keep food on the table, and his mother made sure Richard understood the value of education and hard work. By the time he was 16, Richard was already working part-time jobs, saving every penny he could. He had a dream, one that seemed impossible for a kid from his background. He wanted to own buildings, not just live in them. He wanted to create something that would last long after he was gone. And so, with nothing but ambition and a relentless work ethic, Richard put himself through college, earned a degree in business, and started his first real estate venture at 25 with a loan he barely qualified for. It was a small apartment complex in a rough neighborhood, the kind of place no one else wanted to invest in. But Richard saw potential where others saw risk. He renovated the units himself, learned plumbing and carpentry on the job, and slowly turned that rundown building into a profitable asset. From there, his empire grew. He reinvested every dollar, expanded into commercial real estate, and by the time he was 40, Richard Calloway was a household name in the industry. But success came at a cost. Richard married his college sweetheart, Margaret, when he was 27. She was beautiful, poised, and came from a well-to-do family in Connecticut. At first, their marriage seemed like a fairy tale. Margaret supported Richard's ambitions, hosted dinner parties for his business contacts, and played the role of the perfect wife. They had 2 children, Daniel, their firstborn, and Emily, who came 3 years later. For a while, Richard believed he had it all: the career, the family, the legacy. But as his wealth grew, so did the distance between him and the people he loved. Margaret became more interested in social status than in their relationship. She spent her days at charity galas and country clubs, surrounded by people who valued her last name more than her character. Daniel, their son, grew up entitled and reckless. He had never known struggle, never had to work for anything, and by his early 30s, he was already burning through trust funds and making terrible business decisions. Emily, on the other hand, was different. She was quieter, more introspective, and showed little interest in her father's fortune. She became a high school teacher, much to her mother's disappointment, and lived a modest life in a small apartment in Brooklyn. Richard admired her for that, but he rarely told her so. He was too busy, too consumed by the demands of his empire. Then there was Victor, Richard's younger brother. Victor had always lived in Richard's shadow. He worked for the company, held a senior position, and earned a comfortable salary, but it was never enough. Victor resented Richard's success, and though he never said it outright, Richard could feel the jealousy simmering beneath every conversation they had. Over the years, Richard began to notice things, small things at first. Margaret would disappear for hours without explanation. Daniel would call only when he needed money. Victor would challenge Richard's decisions in board meetings, undermining him in front of investors. And then there were the financial discrepancies. Richard's accountant flagged unusual withdrawals from one of his personal accounts, transactions that Richard didn't authorize. When he confronted Margaret about it, she brushed it off, claiming it was a misunderstanding. But Richard wasn't convinced. He started paying closer attention, started asking questions, and the more he dug, the more unsettled he became. One night, After a particularly tense family dinner where Daniel had demanded an early distribution of his inheritance and Margaret had sided with him, Richard sat alone in his study and asked himself a question that would change everything. If I died tomorrow, would they mourn me or would they celebrate? That question haunted him. It kept him awake at night, gnawed at him during the day. Richard had spent his entire life building something meaningful, something that would outlast him, but for what? For people who saw him as nothing more than a bank account? He needed to know the truth. He needed to see who his family really was when he wasn't around to control the narrative. And so, with the help of his longtime attorney, a man named Paul Decker, Richard began to hatch a plan. It was extreme, perhaps even unethical, but Richard didn't care. He had to know. He had to see their true faces. And the only way to do that was to make them believe he was dead. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. The idea came to Richard during a routine visit to his doctor. Dr. Samuel Harding had been Richard's personal physician for over 20 years, and he was one of the few people Richard truly trusted. During the appointment, Richard mentioned the strange behavior he'd been noticing in his family, the secretive phone calls, the sudden interest in his estate planning, the coldness that had crept into his marriage. Dr. Harding listened carefully, and when Richard finished, the doctor said something that sent a chill down his spine. "Richard, I've seen this before. Families can be dangerous when money is involved. You need to protect yourself." That conversation planted the seed. Richard began researching cases where wealthy individuals had been manipulated, even harmed, by their own relatives. The stories were chilling. There were accounts of staged accidents, poisonings disguised as natural causes, and legal battles that tore families apart. Richard realized he wasn't being paranoid. He was being realistic, and so he reached out to Paul Decker, his attorney, and proposed something unprecedented. "Paul, I want to fake my death. I want to see how they react when I'm gone. I need to know the truth." Paul was stunned. He tried to talk Richard out of it, citing the legal and ethical implications, but Richard was adamant. He wasn't interested in revenge. He wanted clarity. He wanted to see whether the people he loved were capable of loving him back, or whether he had spent his life surrounded by predators. Over the next few weeks, Richard and Paul meticulously planned every detail. They would stage a heart attack, something sudden but believable given Richard's age and stress levels. Dr. Harding would be the attending physician, and he would sign the death certificate. Richard would be secretly transported to a remote property he owned upstate, a cabin in the woods where he could monitor everything from a distance. Paul would install hidden cameras throughout Richard's estate, his home office, the living room, even the kitchen. Richard would watch his family's every move in real time. The plan was risky, and Richard knew it. If anyone discovered the truth, be catastrophic. But he had come too far to turn back. He needed to know. He needed to see. And so, on a quiet Thursday morning in late September, Richard Calloway died. It happened at his office. Richard had been working late, as he often did, when he suddenly collapsed. His assistant called for an ambulance, and within minutes, paramedics arrived. Dr. Harding was already there, having been alerted by Paul. The scene was chaotic, convincing, and utterly heartbreaking for those who witnessed it. Richard was pronounced dead at the hospital an hour later. The news spread quickly. By that evening, every major news outlet was reporting the death of billionaire philanthropist Richard Calloway. Tributes poured in from business leaders, politicians, and charities that had benefited from his generosity. But Richard wasn't watching the news. He was in the back of a van, dressed in clothes he'd never worn before, being driven to the cabin that would become his prison for the next several days. As the van pulled away from the city, Richard felt a strange mix of emotions. Relief, because the hardest part was over. Fear, because he didn't know what he was about to uncover. And sadness, because deep down, He already suspected the truth. His family didn't love him. They loved what he represented. And now, with the cameras rolling and his death certificate signed, he would finally see just how far they were willing to go. The funeral was held 3 days later. It was a grand affair, held at one of Manhattan's most prestigious churches. Hundreds of people attended, including business moguls, city officials, and celebrities who had crossed paths with Richard over the years. But Richard wasn't inside the church. He was across the street, disguised as a homeless man, sitting on a bench with a baseball cap pulled low over his face. He watched as the hearse arrived, as the casket was carried inside, and as his family stepped out of the limousine. Margaret was dressed in black, her face partially hidden behind a veil. She looked elegant, composed, every bit the grieving widow. Daniel walked beside her, his expression unreadable. Emily was a few steps behind, her eyes red and swollen. She was the only one who looked genuinely devastated. The service was beautiful, at least from what Richard could see through the church's open doors. There were speeches, hymns, and a video montage of Richard's life. But something felt off. Richard couldn't quite put his finger on it, but there was a coldness in the air, a sense of performance rather than genuine grief. And then, as the service ended and people began to file out, Richard saw something that made his stomach turn. Margaret stepped away from the crowd, pulled out her phone, and made a call. And as she spoke, she smiled. Back at the cabin, Richard sat in front of a bank of monitors, watching the hidden camera feeds from his estate. He had barely slept since the funeral, and his nerves were frayed. But he couldn't look away. He had to see what happened next. The first few days were relatively quiet. Margaret returned to the estate and spent most of her time in her bedroom. Daniel came and went, making phone calls and meeting with lawyers. Emily visited once, spending an hour in Richard's study, running her fingers over his books and sobbing quietly. It broke Richard's heart to see her in pain, but he couldn't reach out to her. Not yet. Then, on the 4th day, things started to change. Margaret called a meeting with Daniel and Victor in the estate's library. Richard leaned forward, turning up the volume on the feed. "We need to move quickly," Margaret said, her voice calm and businesslike. "Before the will is finalized, Paul is dragging his feet on the estate distribution, and I don't trust him." Daniel nodded. "I already spoke to a lawyer. If we can prove Dad was mentally unfit in his final months, we can contest the will and get full control of the estate." Richard's hands clenched into fists. Mentally unfit? He had never been sharper in his life. Victor chimed in. "What about Emily? She's going to be a problem. She's already asking questions." Margaret waved a dismissive hand. "Emily doesn't care about the money. We'll give her something small to keep her quiet. The rest is ours." Richard felt sick. He had suspected betrayal, but hearing it so plainly laid out was almost unbearable. These were the people he had sacrificed everything for, the people he had trusted with his life, and they were plotting to erase him, to rewrite his legacy, to steal everything he had built. Over the next few days, the conspiracy deepened. Richard watched as Margaret transferred assets into offshore accounts. He saw Daniel forge documents and bribe officials. He saw Victor sabotage business deals to position himself as the new head of the company. And through it all, Emily remained in the dark. She was the only one who wasn't involved, the only one who still mourned him as a father, rather than a meal ticket. But the worst was yet to come. One evening, Richard overheard a conversation between Margaret and Victor that made his blood run cold. They were discussing a plan to have Richard declared mentally incompetent retroactively, which would nullify his will and give them complete control. But that wasn't all. Victor suggested they needed to remove any obstacles that might interfere with their plans. Margaret didn't object. She simply nodded and said, "Do what needs to be done." Richard realized with horror that they weren't just talking about legal obstacles, they were talking about people. About Emily. About anyone who might stand in their way. They had gathered enough evidence to expose the conspiracy, and it was time to bring Richard back from the dead. But Richard wanted one more thing. He wanted to confront them face to face. He wanted them to see what they had become. And so, with Paul's help, Richard arranged a final, dramatic reveal. The confrontation took place at the estate, exactly 2 weeks after Richard's death. Paul had called a meeting under the pretense of finalizing the will. Margaret, Daniel, and Victor arrived, expecting a straightforward legal proceeding. Emily was there too, still grieving, still trying to process the loss of her father. They gathered in the library, the same room where Margaret and Daniel had plotted their takeover. Paul stood at the head of the table, a briefcase in front of him. "Before we begin," Paul said, "there's something you all need to see." He opened the briefcase and pulled out a laptop. On the screen were video clips from the hidden cameras, clips of Margaret transferring money, clips of Daniel forging documents, clips of Victor discussing how to eliminate obstacles. The room went silent. Margaret's face went pale. Daniel looked like he'd been punched in the gut. Victor stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "What is this?" Margaret demanded, her voice shaking. "This," a voice said from the doorway, "is the truth." Everyone turned. Standing in the doorway, very much alive, was Richard Calloway. The reaction was immediate and chaotic. Margaret screamed. Daniel stumbled backward, knocking over a chair. Victor looked like he might pass out. Emily, who had been silent until now, burst into tears and ran to her father, throwing her arms around him. "Dad? How? How is this possible?" Richard held his daughter tightly, his own eyes filling with tears. "I'm sorry, sweetheart. I had to know. I had to see who they really were." He looked past Emily at the others, his expression hardening. "And now I do." What followed was a brutal, emotional confrontation. Richard played more of the footage, showing every lie, every betrayal, every calculated move they had made. Margaret tried to justify herself, claiming she had only been protecting the family's interests. Daniel accused Richard of manipulation, saying the whole thing was entrapment. Victor remained silent, knowing there was nothing he could say. But Richard didn't care about their excuses. He had the evidence he needed, and he had already made his decision. "Margaret, I'm filing for divorce. You'll get nothing beyond what's legally required. Daniel, you're cut off. No more trust fund, no more access to the company. And Victor, you're fired. Effective immediately. I'm also pressing charges for fraud and conspiracy." Margaret tried to protest, but Richard cut her off. "I gave you everything. I built this empire for you, for our family, and you repaid me by wishing I was dead. No, by planning to make sure I stayed dead. You disgust me." The fallout was swift and brutal. The story hit the media within days, and it became a national sensation. Headlines screamed about the billionaire who faked his death to expose his family's greed. Margaret and Daniel were arrested on multiple charges, including fraud, forgery, and conspiracy. Victor fled the country but was eventually extradited and faced trial. Emily, the only innocent party, was devastated by the revelations, but stood by her father's side throughout the ordeal. In the months that followed, Richard rebuilt his life. He restructured his company, putting Emily in charge of the charitable foundation he had established. He donated a significant portion of his wealth to causes he believed in, ensuring that his legacy would be one of genuine good rather than empty gestures. But the experience had changed him. He had always been a private man, guarded and cautious. Now, he was something else entirely. He was broken, yes, but also freed. Freed from the illusion that blood ties meant loyalty. Freed from the burden of pretending his family loved him when they never had. The truth, as painful as it was, had set him free. And then, about 6 months after his resurrection, Richard received devastating news from Dr. Harding. The stress of the ordeal had taken a toll on his health, and a routine scan revealed what Richard had feared but never voiced. He had terminal cancer. Stage 4. Inoperable. He had, at most, a year to live. Richard took the news with a calmness that surprised even himself. In a way, it made sense. He had already lived through his own death once. Facing it again didn't seem so terrifying anymore. He told Emily first, sitting her down in the same study where he had spent so many sleepless nights planning his fake death. "I'm sorry, sweetheart," he said, taking her hand. "I wish I had more time. I wish I could make up for all the years I spent chasing success instead of being your father." Emily cried, but she didn't pull away. "You were always my father, Dad. Even when you were busy, even when you were distant, I always knew you loved me, and that's enough." They spent Richard's final months together, traveling to places he had always wanted to see but never had the time for. They talked about everything, about his childhood, her dreams, the mistakes he had made, and the lessons he had learned. Richard also did something he had never done before. He recorded a video message, a final testimony to be released after his real death. In it, he spoke directly to the camera, his voice steady and clear. "My name is Richard Calloway, and if you're watching this, I'm gone, truly gone this time. I don't know if anyone will care, or if this message will reach anyone beyond my daughter, but I need to say this. Money changes people. Not always for the better. It reveals who they really are, strips away the pretense, and shows you their true nature. I learned that lesson the hard way. I spent my entire life building an empire, thinking it would bring me security, respect, and love. But in the end, it brought me nothing but pain. The people I trusted most, the people I would have died for, were counting down the days until I was gone. And when I finally gave them what they wanted, when I faked my death and watched from the shadows, I saw them for who they really were. Greedy, cruel, heartless. But I also saw something else. I saw my daughter, Emily, grieving for me in a way that was pure and real. And that gave me hope. It reminded me that not everyone is corrupted by wealth. Some people still value love over money, integrity over ambition. If you take anything from my story, let it be this. Test the people around you while you still can. Not with tricks or deception, but with honesty and vulnerability. See how they respond when you need them, when you're at your weakest, because that's when you'll know who they really are. Richard passed away peacefully in his sleep on a quiet Sunday morning, with Emily by his side. His real funeral was small, attended only by those who had truly loved him. There were no grand speeches, no media coverage, no pretense. Just a man being laid to rest by the one person who had mourned him the first time and would mourn him again. Emily inherited the majority of his estate, and she used it to continue his charitable work, ensuring that her father's legacy would be one of compassion rather than greed. Margaret and Daniel both served time in prison, their reputations destroyed. Victor died in exile, alone and forgotten. And Richard's story, once it was made public, became a cautionary tale, a reminder that wealth without love is meaningless, and that family, when corrupted by greed, can become the most dangerous enemy of all. So let me ask you this. If you were in Richard's position, would you have done the same? Would you have faked your death to uncover the truth? And more importantly, how do you think your own family would react if they thought you were gone? Would they mourn you, or would they celebrate? Think about that. And let us know in the comments what you think about Richard's story. Was he right to test his family, or did he go too far? We'd love to hear your thoughts. And if this story moved you, if it made you think about the people in your own life, hit that subscribe button and share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Because in the end, we all deserve to be loved for who we are, not for what we have. Thank you for watching.